Okay, so welcome back. In our last video, we talked about how you can very quickly and easily read in a CSV file like I have here on the right and map each line of the CSV file to a corresponding class object in your code. So for example, here I've got 17 lines in this CSV file, and each line has 4 values, 4 integer numbers. And the header shows element type, status, bin number, and isFault are the names of each value. And we showed how to very quickly convert those into objects of this elements class that have exactly the same names in their properties as the header for each of these values in the CSV file. So basically, we're making 17 elements objects in our code very quickly and populating their 4 properties with these values in each line. So what we're going to do in this video is we're going to go another step and use generics to make our lives a bit easier, so that we can do like we can specify any class that we do this on. We specify a CSV file and a matching class, and we can use a generic method to do this on any type of class and CSV file. We don't have to have a specific one. Now, I encourage you, if you like or kind of like any of these videos, please hit the like button and the subscribe button and the bell notifications, and especially if you think anybody else might get any benefit out of these, I encourage you to let them know, let others know about these videos. It would help out a lot. So what we're going to do is first look at the code we generated last time, and it was fairly straightforward. We used a NuGet package called CSV Helper, and I encourage you to take a look at that video to see how we did it. And as I mentioned, we've got this elements class that has very simple, it's only 4 properties. And we have made a list of elements, and we called it records. And we use these few lines of code along with CSV Helper to read in a CSV file. I called it logic.csv. Read in that file, and then using the CSV Reader and the CSV Helper, we populated 17 records objects from this in this elements class and converted them to a list. And then what we did is we put them into a data grid view. So I'll run this and show you. And here's the data grid view, and you can see it matches exactly our input CSV file. Okay, so what we now want to do is say, hey, you know, I had to specify a particular CSV file, and we had to specify what class I wanted to read that into. Can we make this like a generic method and maybe get it out of our main application and put it into maybe a tools library, a class library somewhere, and have it kind of generic and just feed it a class and a CSV file and have it do that magically behind the scenes, and it just returns the list of objects, and we can then work on those. So that's what we're going to do in this video and show how to do that. Instead of specifying the name of a CSV file, we're going to use an open file dialog to, at runtime, have the user able to select the CSV file that matches the classes that we want to map to. So here is the code we're going to come up with. And I'm going to step through each line to show you what I ended up with. And the most important part is, here's the method up here, and here's the method signature. And this might look kind of strange to you, but this is one way to have a very generic method where you can feed it any type of object you want. So we'll start out here. You can see I've got a public static method here. And this is part of a what I call a tools library or a class library of classes that I have hanging around. So when I write a piece of code, if I need some methodology or if I need a function to do something, if it exists in the library, I'll just refer to the library and save myself a lot of work. So here I've got a method, public static, and it will return a list of something. And that something is a generic type that in this case, we're not specifying what the type is. We're going to leave that up to the user at runtime. So you could fill this in with an int or a string or a specific object. We're using a generic type here to say we don't know, but we're going to decide later. And here's the name of the method. You can see it's read CSV to class. And this is going to probably look a little bit strange to you. This, with generics, this is the way that we can feed this method a generic object, in this case, that it can work on. So normally we feed in inputs to a method inside these parentheses. Here we can do both. We can feed some, like if I wanted to input or feed in a file name, I could say string file name and have it use that file name. We don't need that because we're using an open file dialog. But we are going to have a generic, in this case, a class that we want to map the CSV to. And we're going to feed it in right here where this T is. This where statement says, okay, we're telling you that this T is going to be a class. So here is the method. We're feeding in a T where a T, in this case, is going to be a class. All right. So that's how you make this method generic. You say, I'm going to feed in a class. Before we had our elements class. But we can choose any class we want since this is generic. So the T is going to be a class, and then we can feed in that class and do our method. So very important to keep in mind the signature of the method that you're going to make generic. So here's our method, basically fairly simple. Like last time, we're going to specify a list of objects that we're going to generate. Last video we did an elements class, we generated objects. Here we're going to use a generic list. We don't know what it is, we're going to find out later. And we're going to call it records. This next line is a standard open file dialog. I called it OFD. And then we specify for the open file dialog the initial directory, in my case dtemp. And then in my case, I'm using a filter to only list the CSV files in that dtemp directory. And here's the format for that. So here's my open file dialog, very straightforward. Here we go through and do the actual work, very similar to what we did in the last video. But we're putting it inside an if statement to make sure that the open file dialog was successful. So it shows the dialog, and if we got a good result, we go through and do exactly the same thing as we did in the previous video. We set up a stream reader, and we call it reader. And I explained before why we have these using statements. I encourage you to check that out. The only difference is now we are using as an input to the stream reader the result of this open file dialog, and that's the ofd.filename. That's the file name that was returned when we selected the file. And then we use the CSV helper to make a CSV reader. And there's basically one line of code here where we go through and we read the CSV file using this get records. And again, we're using the generic input to that. And then we convert that to a list and we get our list of records, which is this here. We've got our list of records. And then we return that list of records to the calling application. So again, it's very straightforward. We can select at runtime the CSV file, And then we can tell this method, it can be a generic method where we tell it what class we want to use to match to the CSV file. And then I've got an else statement, which you're not going to need. I just put in something in case the open file dialog doesn't work. But basically, that's all it is. So what I've done is I have made up a different class. And in this case, I've made up a switches class. And I've got some doubles with different names. And I've got a CSV file that matches that. So here is the other CSV file, and you can see it's got different, a different header, different names that match the properties of the switches class. And we're going to go through and show that we can now just use this generic method to open a different type of CSV and use a different class. So I'll go over to my Form 1, and what we can do now is, instead of what we had in the previous video, where we go through and do this in our main method, I'm just going to comment that out. And instead, I'm going to use this single line of code where I've already described my list of elements called records. And I'm going to use this method that I just showed you. This is in the file operations class. I'm going to use this method we just generated, and all I've got is one line. I use the file operations read CSV to class, which is the method we just used, and I feed it the class that I want it to map to. Before we use this elements class, so all I'm going to do is change this to the switches class, and change this to switches class. And we'll see if we can now read in this CSV to the switches class and put it in our data grid. So again, one line of code, and all I have to do is change one thing, and we can use a generic class. So I'll run this. And I will go and I will select my switches class. And here's our updated data grid view. We can see now it used the switches CSV and the switches class to generate 17 or however many, or I think it was 13 switches objects and populate their properties. So again, very nice and easy if you can use generic methods like this to build like a class library of functionality that you can use in your other code. So again, hope this helps. And if you like any of these videos, again, I encourage you to hit the like button and the subscribe and the bell notifications, especially if you know of anybody who might benefit from any of these videos. I encourage you to let them know and make it public. Anyway, appreciate it. Take care and have a really good day. Thanks.